Hello, this is William from Visual Components. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create a plugin that uses the context of the application. For example, I'm going to show you how to read in the current context of the application. I'm going to show you how to assign a handler to the event whenever the context changes in the 3D product. And I'm also going to show you how to create an action that can take multiple arguments and how you can execute that action in the .NET as well as in a Python script. So you ready? Alright, let's get started. It's the same setup as before, so I'll open the Windows toolbar, do a search for Visual Studio, and then I'll right click the program, and I'm going to run it as an administrator. Let's now create a new project. So on the start page, I'll click New Project, and we're going to create a class library, and notice I'm using .NET Framework 4.5, and the language is Visual C#. Let's go ahead and rename the class library to be Example 003. I'll press Enter, and now Visual Studio will create the project for me, which you can see here in the Solution Explorer pane. Let's now add the references for our plugin. So I'll right-click References, then click Add Reference. In the Reference Manager, you want to add those three libraries from your Visual Components program files. So Create 3D Shared, UX Shared, and Caliburn Micro. Remember, you can find those in the program files of your 3D project from Visual Components. Let's now add that one library we need from the .NET Framework called System Component Model Composition. So this one right here. I'll click OK, and here are the references. Let's now add using statements for those references. So in my code, go ahead and create some white space and add a using statement for system.componentModel.composition, and using Caliburn.micro, and using Visual Components, create 3D, and using Visual Components.ux.shared. And since we're creating a plugin, let's go ahead and implement our class with that iPlugin interface. So I typed it there for the class declaration. Let's now point at that interface and use the light bulb to implement the interface explicitly. And we don't need to worry about that exit of the plugin when it's closing, so we can get rid of that code. And when the plugin is initializing, what do we want to do? Well, we first want to get a handle and know what is the context of the application when it first starts up. Now to do that, we're going to use an interface called iApplicationContext. So to get a handle, I'll write the type first, so iApplicationContext, and I'll just name my variable app_context equals, and I'm going to use the IOC to get an instance of that object. So it's iApplicationContext. And now, sorry, that was iApplication. It's iApplicationContext. And there we go. And now I want to know the current context of the application. So that type, every type of context is an I context. And my variable will just be current context. And then we'll use our app.context to get this property here called current. And notice its type is I context. And then what do we want to do? We want to print a message that tells us what the context of the application is. So we'll print that to the output panel. So in the previous videos, you learned about the iMessage service. So iMessage service ms equals, and we'll use that IOC to get an instance of iMessage service. And then we'll append a message, so ms.append message. And what message do we want to append? Well, let's actually first create a string for that. So we'll say string message equals current context is, and I'll use a plus sign, and now let's concatenate or add that context to our message. So we'll say current context dot ID, which is of type string. And now in our append message, let's have our first argument as our message, and then our message level to be a warning. So now let's go ahead and export our class as a plugin. So before the class declaration, let's add an export attribute, parentheses, use that type of constructor to export this as a type of I plugin. So to quickly go over what we did, when we're initializing our plugin, we're getting a handle for the context of the application using iApplicationContext. We're then getting a handle for what the current context of the application is, And then we're using the message service to print a message to the output panel telling us what that context is based on its ID. We now need to define the properties of our project, so we'll go to the project menu here and open example 003 properties. And I'm going to use a prefix of plugin for my assembly name, so plugin dot followed by the assembly name. And for our build, let's target 64-bit. And for our output path where we want to build our library, let's browse to our Visual Components program files. And I'm using Visual Components Premium, and that's the folder. So I'll select folder. Let's now go to debug because we want to test with the software. So I'll select Start External Program, and now I'll select the executable for my Visual Components 3D product. So I'll go to the program files, and I'm using Premium, but in any case it should be visualcomponents.engine.exe, so this executable. Open that. Let's go ahead and save everything and go back to our code. And now let's go ahead and start debugging and see how this happens. So what we expect is the message that we wrote here, current context is .current context ID, should be printed in the output panel. So I'll press start, and the software is loaded up, and we can see in the output panel, there's our message of current context is configure. So let's say we want to get the context ID for these other tabs, these other contexts we have for the drawing world, and when we go to the program tab to program the robot, and when we go to modeling as well. So let's actually go back to Visual Studio now, and I'm going to stop debugging. And now to know when the context of the application changes, I'm going to create a function or a method and then tie that function to an event. So to do that, let's actually use a constructor for our plugin. So it's called class 1, so let's rename that. So go to the Solution Explorer pane and right click class 1, click rename, and let's rename this to be my plugin. And then Visual Studio will take care of the rest for me. And then our constructor will be public, my plugin, parentheses, get those curly brackets. And now when we construct this, we need to get a handle for the app context, which we have down here when we initialize it. So I'm actually going to use an importing constructor. So for my constructor, I'm going to add an attribute to identify this as an importing constructor to the MEF. And then for our argument, our first one, or parameter, sorry, we're going to import something. So I'll add an import type of, and it's a type of iApplication context. Then the first parameter is going to be of that type as well, so iApplication context, and we'll use the same name of app.context. And now let's go and create a private variable in this class for getting a handle for that instance. So before the constructor, I'll just say private iApplication context is app_context. And notice we don't have to give it a null value, we can just keep it like this. So then in our constructor, I'll say this .app context equals app context. And now, if I say this .app context, and I add a dot or a full stop here, notice we can now get a handle for this event handler called context change. So if I now add the context change, and if I add a plus sign and an equal sign, and press the tab key, notice that it automatically creates a new function that I can then tie to this event handler. So notice it's called app context change. So I want to rename this. So I will say print current context, and I'll press the enter key. And now this is the name of my function. And what do we want to do here? So let's get rid of this line of code. And we want to do the same thing we were doing when we initialized the plugin. So for this code right here, we could comment it out, just get rid of it. So let's actually copy everything, and I'll cut it, and now I'll just paste it inside my function called print current context. So paste that, and notice we have some redundancy here. We no longer need to get handle for the for this app context here, so we can comment that out because we use the MEF instead of the IOC to get a handle for the iApplication context instance. So we can still get the current context. And then we're using that message service to print the current context with this message of current context is. So every time the context changes in the application, this function is going to be called, and we can then know what that current context ID is. So let's go ahead and start debugging again. And the application is loaded up, but we notice nothing has been printed to the output panel. That's because our function for printing the current context is tied to an event. So, notice the context has not changed yet. But now, if we go to the Drawing tab, we can see that our message is now printed in the output panel, and it's showing that the current context, its ID, is drawing. So let's actually see how this works for the Program tab. We can see its context is teach, and if we go to the Modeling tab, we can see its context is author. So let's say when we start the application, we do want to know what the current context is. So I can just go back to Visual Studio and stop debugging. And when we initialize the plugin, let's go ahead and call this function here a print current context. And we need to assign it pass some arguments, so I'll just pass null for both of those arguments. And what we expect to happen is when we start the application, we should get the indication of what the current context is by calling this function here. And let's go ahead and press start. And notice now that the application is loaded up, we can see in the output panel, there's our message, and everything still works as normal. So when I change the context, you can see the output message printed there. Great. Let's go ahead and stop debugging. So I'll go back to Visual Studio and stop debugging. Now in some cases you may want to reuse this code and call it many times, either in your Python script or in another plugin. So what we can do is we can create an action for what we did here for the context. To do that, let's go and add another class that we implement as an action. So let's create some white space here and scroll down. And I'll type public class, and this is going to be my context action. That's what I'll name the class. So my context action. Remember, this needs to derive from action item. Now, in the previous video, I showed you how to create an action item that did not take any arguments. Now I'm going to show you how you can create an action that can take multiple arguments. So to do that, you can create this action with these greater than less signs, and we can define the types of each argument. So if I type in string here and bool here, I can just keep on going and type as many arguments as I need to. And then when I go to execute this action in that method, it's going to show the parameters of what I defined here. So let's actually keep it simple first and just have one argument of a string, the message we want to be printed with this action. So let's now add the curly braces or brackets for the class. And let's go ahead and implement that constructor for the class. So my context action, parentheses, and we're going to use the base constructor inherited from action item, the base class. So base keyword, and we just need to give it an ID. And the ID will be print current context. And then we'll add the curly braces again. And there we go. And now, once I said before, we have to define what happens when this action is executed. So we're going to override the execute method, but this is if the action did not have any arguments. So you can notice now I have an override for this called execute, and there's our argument of string that we defined in the action item for the class. So execute for that string, and we don't need this line of code here. And what do we want to happen when we execute it? We want to print the current context of the application. So if we go back to our plugin, we can just copy and paste this code if we wanted to in our print current context function. So I'll just select it and copy it and paste it here. And I'm going to uncomment this line of code here to get a handle for the application context. And everything looks fine. And we can now do the same thing we were doing before, but notice we can now get an indication of what message we also want to print. And we actually should probably keep this simple at first. So what I'm going to do, since we already know that we can create this action with multiple arguments, is actually we'll just pass 0 arguments to it. So let's change this class declaration as well, and just make it a normal action at first, and then we'll go on and add the more arguments as we go. But we just want to test this first. So let's now call this action in our main plugin. So for the print current context, we don't need this code anymore. So I'm going to comment it out. So I'll select the line of code that's not commented, And then you can either press the shortcut for Control plus K or Control plus C, or this icon here to comment the code. And now when we print the current context, that event handler, let's get a handle for the command registry to call the action. So I command registry, and I'll call this net commands equals IOC, get that instance of the command registry. And then let's go ahead and execute that action. And the action ID was print current context. And there we go. And now when we initialize the plugin, it should call this function as well, and notice it will take care of the printing for us. So in order to make that happen, we need to also make sure we export our action as a type of iAction item. So we'll add an export attribute, type of iAction item. So what did we just do? Well, we created an action item that doesn't take any arguments, and then when it's executed, we are going to have it print the current context of the application. We're then calling that action whenever the context of the application changes using our plugin. So let's now start debugging and see how this works. The application is loaded up, and we can see our message printed to the output panel. So let's now test when we change the context by clicking the Drawing tab. And yep, it still prints our output message for the Drawing tab, the Program tab, and the Modeling tab. Great. Let's go ahead and stop debugging. And as I promised, we now want to create an action item that can take multiple arguments. So I'll go back to my action item. And in the class declaration, when it inherits that base class of action item, we also want to have a parameter called string. And then when we execute the action, we need to also print out that message we give it. So we'll then we could either append the message to what we're printing for the current context or after it. So let's actually do that. So just copy this line of code here and then paste, and then when we append a new message, we'll just print out that P1 argument or whatever is passed to this action. So to execute our action now, let's go back to our plugin, and this will no longer work since we have to pass arguments to this command we're calling by this ID. So I'm going to comment out this line of code here. Now we need to use the command registry to find the action we want to execute. So that's going to be an action item of type based on the arguments we're giving it. So we passed one argument or one parameter of string, and we'll just call that my action. And then we'll use the net commands object to find an item. And what is that item we want to find? We'll have to find it by its key or its ID. So that's the print current context. And we need to cast this as the type of action it is. So action item and that parameter we have of string. And now we need to execute this action. So my action dot execute. And notice we now can pass it the string we need to give it. So notice we have this override here. And there's the string P1. So what string do we want to say? Let's say, how is it going? So what we expect to happen is we now changed our action to take one parameter, one argument passed to it. And we're then executing that action by getting it from the command registry and then passing in an argument when we execute it. So let's now start debugging again and see how this all works. Alright, the application is loaded up, and we can see there's our output panel, there's the first message, and there's the message we passed to our action. How's it going? So let's see what happens when we click the Drawing tab. It prints both messages, and the same for the Programming tab. Great. So what we've done is we created an action that prints messages to the output panel, and one of those messages is a string message that we give to that action. Now, if you want to execute this action in a Python script, you do need to add a bit more logic to your action, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. Let's go back to Visual Studio and stop debugging. And we can notice here for our action item, this execute method that takes one argument, This works in our plugin, but now if we're going to call this action using that net command in Python API, we're going to have to add an additional override for that execute method so it works, because we're going to be passing arguments in our Python script to this action item. Now to do that, we're going to use override, and it's going to be this execute method here for property collection arguments. So the arguments are going to be taken from the Python script and then made into that collection and then given to the action. So this is what we need to override. And let's get rid of this line of code. We don't need it. And what we're going to do is we're just going to call this method we created here where it takes that string argument. So we're going to say execute. And what are we calling? We're calling the execute method that we override to take that string argument. And we know in this case we're only passing one argument, so let's first do a cast to make sure it's a string. And then for our args, that's passed to that collection. Let's go ahead and get the first one and that value. So what we did is we created another override for this execute method for our action that takes a collection of arguments. And then we're calling our other override of execute that takes a string argument. And notice here we're using that collection to get the first item, which should be a string, and then passing that as a argument to this execute method here. So this method here will still work with our plugin. It's just that when we call this action using our Python script, it's now going to use this method here. So let's see how that works. I'll go ahead and start debugging. And we'll just wait for the software to load up, and then we'll start creating a Python script. So the software is loaded up. Now, if you don't have access to the modeling tab, you need to create a Python command to kind of test this for yourself. But I do have access to the modeling tab, so I'll go there now. And we want to clear the output panel. And now let's create a new component. And I'll go to the geometry group and click the features arrow just to give it one block feature and zoom in. So there's the component. Let's now add a Python script, so I'll go to the behavior group, click the behaviors arrow, and then click Python script. And now we don't need this snippet. And same as before, we'll get a handle for the application, so app equals get application. And then we want to find that command that's used for calling our .NET commands, so app.find command. And the name of that command is net command, so lowercase n, capital C. And then when that command is executed, it can call our net command by its ID, which in this case is print current context. And now we can give it an argument. So what message do we want to print? Let's say it is going good. And let's go ahead and compile the code. And we can see in the output panel the current context is author, and there's our message of it is going good. Great. Let's now see how this works with a component property. So let's actually close the script editor. And now let's add a component property. So I'll go to the properties group, click the properties arrow, add a button. And now for this name of the button, let's say call my context command. And here's the button. And now let's create another property that has a string, which will then pass to our action that we want printed in the output panel. So I'll go back to the properties group and add a string property. And I'll just rename this property to be message. And now let's go ahead and define a default value for it. So let's say, this is a tough one. Pizza is good. I like pizza. I hope you like pizza. Some people don't. It's okay. Now let's go back to our Python script. So in the component graph panel, I'll double click the Python script to access the editor. And before we don't need this setup anymore, so let's clear this to start fresh. Let's get a handle for the component, so comp equals get component. Get a handle for that button, so button equals comp.get property. And the name of the button was call my context command. And then we want to define a function that is called every time the value of the button changes. So let's say my function. Give a different name for the function if you want to. And notice this function takes one argument value. And now we want to get a handle for that net command again. So get a handle for the application, then find the command, and then execute the command. So command.execute. the name of the command is print current context. And let's go ahead and pass it the value of that string message we set up in the component, that message property. So I'll say comp.message, and since the component property is global, I can just reference it like this and it will just give me the value. So now if I compile the code, see that nothing was executed. That's because I did not tie the buttons on change event to my function or change its value yet, sorry. I need to do that now, so I'll say button.onChanged equals my function. So let's compile the code, and I'll minimize the script editor. Let's go to the Home tab. I have the component selected, and let's clear the output panel for now. And the component properties panel, there's our message, pizza is good. And here's our button, call my context command. So if I click it, pay attention to the output panel. Hey, there we go. The current context is configure for configuring a layout, and it prints my message that pizza is good. So if we actually want to talk back to our output panel, let's say, I really like pizza too. Okay. And I click the call my context command, and it prints the feedback message. Great. Let's now go back to Visual Studio and clean up our code a bit before we end the video. So let's go back to Visual Studio, stop debugging, and for our action item, for that ID, print current context, I made a mistake here and I'm sorry. It's usually good practice to have a suffix of command so we know that this ID here is saying print current context command, and we can clearly see that this is a command. So if you're using it in a Python script or somewhere else, you know that, hey, this is actually a command I'm executing. Now this ends the video. If you have any more questions, you can go to our forum at forum.visualcomponents.com, and this project and plugin you'll find a link to in the video description. So as always, have a wonderful day.